I never thought a late-night stop at a diner would leave me questioning if I'd make it out alive, but that's exactly what happened. It was just after midnight when I pulled off the highway. The glowing neon sign of a small roadside diner was the only light for miles. I was tired and hungry after a long day of driving. The place looked empty, but the open sign flickered weakly in the window. I figured I could grab a quick meal and be back on the road in no time. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside. The air smelled like burnt coffee and old grease. There was no one at the counter or in the booths. I called out, "Hello, is anyone here?" After a few seconds, a man emerged from the kitchen. He was tall and gaunt, with hollow cheeks and deep-set eyes. He didn't say a word, just handed me a menu and disappeared back through the swinging doors. The menu was sticky and yellowed with age. I decided on a burger and fries. As I waited, I noticed how eerily quiet the diner was. No music, no chatter from the kitchen, just the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above me. The clock on the wall ticked louder than seemed possible. After what felt like an eternity, the man returned with my food. He set the plate down without a word and walked away. The burger looked undercooked. The fries were limp and greasy, but I was too hungry to care. I ate quickly, trying not to think about how off everything felt. That's when the door opened. A man walked in, wearing a tattered coat and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He didn't look at me. He didn't even glance at the menu. He just sat in the booth across from mine and stared down at the table. I tried not to pay attention, but something about him made my skin crawl. The minutes ticked by. He didn't move, didn't order, didn't say a word. The gaunt man from the kitchen didn't come back out either. I started feeling uneasy. The air seemed heavier. It was like the diner itself was pressing in on me. I finished my meal and stood to leave. The man in the booth finally moved. His eyes were wide and unblinking. His eyes were wide and unblinking. His skin was pale and waxy, like a mannequin's. He smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was a slow, deliberate grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Leaving already," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. As I reached the door, he called out again. "You shouldn't have come here." I froze, my hand on the handle. My heart pounded in my chest. I turned to look at him, but he was gone. The booth was empty. I glanced back at the counter. The gaunt man was standing there watching me. His expression was blank, but his eyes were sharp and full of something I couldn't place. I bolted out the door and into my car. The diner's neon sign flickered as I started the engine. I didn't look back as I sped down the empty road, but even now, I can't stop thinking about it. I've driven past that stretch of highway a dozen times since. The diner isn't there anymore. It's just an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. But every time I pass it, I get the same heavy feeling in my chest. I don't know what happened that night. I don't want to know. All I know is I'll never stop at another diner alone again. I never thought it would happen to me, sitting alone in that empty diner, eating my food in silence while the lights flickered every few minutes. It was just another night until I realized I wasn't alone. You'll still remember. That night, like it was yesterday. It was late, almost 2 a.m., when I decided to grab a quick bite at the diner. I was passing through town and wanted something hot and greasy to stave off the cold. The diner was a small, run-down place with flickering lights and red vinyl booths. Your classic 24-hour joint. I was the only customer in there, which wasn't unusual for this time of night. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a permanent scowl on her face, brought me a menu without a word. I ordered a burger and fries, feeling oddly uneasy under her watchful gaze. The food arrived quickly, the grease pooling on the plate as she set it down in front of me. I dug in, enjoying the quiet of the diner as I ate. The only sound, the occasional clink of the kitchen staff's dishes in the back. As I was finishing up my meal, I noticed the lights flicker again. Once, twice, 3 times, before finally settling into a steady dim. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe the wiring was old. But then I noticed something strange in the reflection of my glass. At first, I thought it was my imagination, just some trick of the light or a shadow in the window. Then I saw it again. Something moving behind me appeared like a slow-moving light of my door being opened and closed. I stopped in my tracks. In the bright light from the outside, I turned around slowly, my stomach tightening, and that's when I saw him. A man, dressed in a threadbare coat, his eyes hidden under the brim of a worn-out fedora. He was sitting at a booth in the back, staring at me. I turned away, dismissing it as paranoia. But when I glanced back a minute later, he was closer, only a few feet away now, still watching me with those dark, lifeless eyes. The waitress came by to clear my plate. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice low and tense. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. "Yeah, just fine," I lied, forcing a smile. She seemed to buy it, but I could tell she wasn't happy to have me there. I paid my bill quickly and made my way to the door, my heart pounding in my chest. As I walked past the man in the corner, I felt his eyes follow me, his gaze never leaving my back. I half expected him to say something, but he remained silent, watching as I stepped out into the night. It was in that moment that I realized that we hadn't stepped into a cleared space together. As I got into my car and started to drive away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the man still sitting there, unmoving, his eyes fixed on me. It felt like he was sending some silent message, warning me that I shouldn't have left the diner. To this day, I wonder who he was and what he wanted. All I know is that night changed me. Now, every time I pass by that diner, I can't help but look over my shoulder, half expecting to see him sitting in one of those booths, still watching, still waiting. It's a chilling reminder that some places, some stories, are better left untold. I should have kept driving. I should never have stopped at that diner. It was close to 1 a.m. when I saw the neon sign glowing in the distance. Hollow's Diner. The letters buzzed faintly against the pitch-black sky. My stomach was growling, and the thought of coffee and a hot meal was too tempting to resist. The parking lot was empty. No other cars, just mine. I should have taken that as a warning. I stepped inside. The air felt stale, heavy, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows that stretched across the tiled floor. A waitress appeared from behind the counter. Her uniform looked old, the edges fraying, but her face was younger than I expected. She gave me a strange smile, like she was sizing me up, and handed me a menu without a word. The menu was odd. No prices, just generic listings like burger and coffee. I ordered a coffee and a sandwich, and she nodded before disappearing into the kitchen. As I sat there, I noticed how quiet the place was. No music, no clinking of dishes, not even the hum of a fridge. Just silence. I glanced around. The booths were all empty. The counter stools looked unused. There was a faint smell of something burnt, but I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I waited, and I waited. The lights flickered again, and for a second, I thought I saw movement in the corner of the room. When I turned to look, there was nothing there. The waitress returned with my coffee. She set it down without a word. Her hands trembled slightly, and her smile was gone. I asked if everything was okay, but she just nodded and walked away, quickly. I took a sip of the coffee. It was lukewarm and bitter, but I didn't care. I was tired and just wanted to finish my meal and leave. That's when the door opened. Man walked in. He wore a long coat and a hat pulled low over his face. He didn't look at me or the waitress. He just sat down at a booth near the back, his movements slow and deliberate. I tried not to stare, but something about him felt off. The waitress didn't approach him. She stayed behind the counter, her eyes darting nervously toward the man. I could feel the tension in the air. It was like the room was holding its breath. I decided to focus on my food, but my appetite was gone. I kept glancing at the man in the booth. He wasn't moving, just sitting there, his head slightly tilted, as if he was listening to something I couldn't hear. The lights flickered again. This time they stayed dim for a moment longer. When they came back, the man was gone. His booth was empty. My heart started racing. I hadn't heard him leave. The door hadn't opened. I looked at the waitress. Her face was pale, her hands gripping the counter tightly. "You need to go," she said softly. Her voice was barely audible, but there was urgency in it. I stood up, fumbling for my wallet. I asked her what was going on, but she shook her head. "Just leave. Now." I dropped a few bills on the table and headed for the door. As I reached for the handle, I heard a low whisper behind me. It wasn't the waitress. It wasn't coming from the kitchen. It was right behind me. "You shouldn't have stopped here." I turned around, but there was no one there. The diner was empty. The waitress was gone. The counter was spotless, like no one had been there at all. I bolted out the door and into my car. The diner's neon sign flickered as I started the engine. I sped out of the parking lot, not daring to look back. When I reached the next town, I pulled into a gas station and told the clerk what had happened. He gave me a strange look and said, "There's no diner on that stretch of road. Hasn't been for years. Burned down in the 80s. I drove back the next day, convinced I'd find it. But the spot where the diner had been was nothing but an empty lot. The ground was charred, overgrown with weeds. A rusted signpost was all that remained. I don't know what I walked into that night. I don't know who or what was in that diner. But I'll never forget the way it felt, the heavy air, the whispers that still echo in my mind, and I'll never stop at another diner after midnight again.